Hey there guys, so we got 100 subscribers and I'm very grateful for that, but I thought that maybe it's gonna be a bit too cliche to just make a vlog about how much I'm grateful for all the things you're giving me. Instead of that, I'm gonna do you one better. Why not just, why shouldn't I just read you a story I wrote a few years ago? It's a short story. It's not well written, but it might be a bit fun. So enjoy yourself. Remember, it's all for fun. I'm not a professional writer or anything like that. I didn't have anything to do with writing for years. So that's gonna be all. It was already getting dark at the time of day. The days were getting shorter, the nights longer. The ancient forest in the distance seemed even gloomier than the surrounding area, but not in a deterrent manner, but as if ancient secrets dormant in it waited to be discovered. Some claimed that the forest was calling to them. Not many of those who decided to go deeper returned to the living. Those who did lost their minds, or at least that was what the legend said. A small caravan consisting of several guards, 2 horses and a large brass cage carried by them was passing through a nearby road. Everyone was tired. They have not stopped for 8 hours. Yesterday's storm caused some roads to be impassable. It was so strong that it overturned many trees which blocked the passages. They all had to make up for the lost time. Derwan, the captain of the guard, was promoted quickly. He was an impatient but honest man, and above all he was simple-minded. "How far to the city, captain?" asked the youngest of the guards, your youth with a fair, girlish appearance, barely reached adulthood. He was dressed in a large, worn tunic, probably after his father. His face covered an uneven, barely visible stubble. "A dozen miles or so," he replied, then added after a short pause, "We will not get there before dawn." "There is always a different way," the prisoner, who had been quietly sitting up till now, intervened. "Well, look, he can speak," snarled a stocky, bald guard. Then he spat inside the cage. "What do you mean?" Yor asked hesitantly, even though something in his gut already knew the answer. "We could get to the Vale City before midnight. I know just the way. The only thing we have to do is turn left from the road. Go straight through that forest." He pointed his old, slightly crooked finger to the south, in the direction of the very place they've been avoiding. His words uttered and magically deteriorated the already terrible mood. "I knew you were a murderous fuck, but not a stupid murderous fuck," the bald guard with obvious anger issues shouted at the prisoner, then slammed his wooden baton against the bars. Yor heard the stories about the horrors that the prisoner committed. He used to be a leader of some cult in the west, was mostly known for slaughtering women as a sacrifice to his deity. The country was full of cults. This one was different, much more cruel. When he was caught, he gave up without a fight. They said he murdered 13 people so far, but who knows what his actual count is. "At ease, Barrick, let him speak," Derwan said calmly, suddenly appearing a few steps next to the wagon. "You know everyone is tired, Captain. In addition, the trail is full of tribes. Those who would gladly take away what you have, or worse. Forgive me for saying that, but I do not think your tired fivesome in the middle of the night would be able to defeat the band of blood ravens," continued the prisoner. His melodic, charismatic voice echoed through their minds. Derwan chuckled. "No blood ravens have been seen here in months. What do you want to gain from it? Do you want to die so soon? Ravens or any other band matters not. Thing is that out in the open like that, we're an easy target. If we go through the forest, I assure you that nothing will happen to us. You are not superstitious, Captain. Blood ravens are, just like any other band. They are afraid of the forest. kept persuading the ragged old man. Then he smiled mischievously under his nose. Derwan marched back to his position up ahead, joining back to the female ranger. He scratched his bushy brown beard in contemplation, thinking about their next move. They didn't have any more rations left. The water was almost gone too, and on top of that, they were all exhausted. If anyone attacked them, even if they'd managed to fend them off, the losses would be more than he could handle. "You do not actually believe him, Captain?" The quiet so far Lana interjected his thoughts. She was a perceptive, smart woman, with a good sense of judgment, dressed in dark leather pants and a brown, thick coat with a hood. Her raven black hair hung down her back, tied in a ponytail. The girl's pale face was covered in dozens of freckles. Besides a few features showing she came from a village, she could easily be seen as attractive. It doesn't matter whether I believe him or not, the truth is that we don't have many choices. I would rather risk going through that forest than have to deal with real dangers on the road. He responded, sighed, turned his head around and yelled out to the rest of the group. "Alright everyone, you have to get to Vale City as quickly as possible. We're going." Through the woods. Everyone's expressions suddenly shifted to a grimace. Some of them gave out noises of disappointment and discontent. Lana grabbed her silver medallion that she wore on her neck and whispered something quietly. Ludwig, the slender man with hair in the color of auburn, who was steering the wagon, gave out a loud command to the two work horses carrying it. Shortly after, they were already on the move. They found a path wide enough for 3 people going shoulder to shoulder and pressed on with uncertainty. It was almost impossible to spot, as no one really walked this path for a long time. The wagon drove slowly through the uneven surface, brass cage rattling every now and then when one of the wheels hit against a rock. When they approached the edge of the forest, even the captain began to feel unsure. As they passed the line of trees, it suddenly went dark. Visibility at 4-5 feet, no more. "Light the torches!" Captain commanded. Yor approached one of the horses and reached the saddlebag, took out 2 wooden torches and gave one of them to Barik, kept the other one to himself and lit it with a pair of flints. Took around 4 strikes for the damp rags to finally catch flame. After he was done, he gave the flints to the bold guard. It got brighter, but not much. It was as if the ominousness of the forest tried to suppress all light, devour every spark, every beam, till there's nothing left but darkness. Barik led the way with the wagon trailing behind him. Ludwig and Derwan conversed about some matter quietly. Meanwhile, Lana and Yor followed behind in silence. The light cast by the torches created shadows that could easily be mistaken with rays and other dark creatures. The heavy, suffocating tension in the air made the young boy jumpy. He looked back every few seconds, as if he was checking if someone was following them. He couldn't shake off the uncomfortable feeling from the back of his neck that they're being watched ever since they stepped foot in the forest. "What made you take on the guard, kid?" the ranger asked, trying to break the awful silence. Kid? She could not have been more than 30 years old herself, thought Yor. Then he answered after a while. "After my father's death, I felt I had to follow in his footsteps." "How did he die? War?" she asked with curiosity. "No, he disappeared somewhere in these lands, these mountains," Yor explained reluctantly, and a grimace crossed his face. "Where is the certainty that he is dead?" the archer kept pressing. "It happened 2 years ago. I know him. He just would not go away like that." Yor scowled completely. Lana stopped asking so as not to inflict more pain on the boy. After a moment, she bumped him with a shoulder and said, "I think he would be proud of you." "Would he?" Yor whispered softly. Yor was not so sure about that. Lana was about to add something, but the conversation was interrupted by the noise of the wheel breaking apart. A loud, cracking noise of oak wood giving up against nature. The wagon skewed on one side and suddenly stopped. "For fuck's sake! At this rate we'll never get there!" Derwan roared in frustration. Then he let a chain of foul words out of his mouth and added after a second, "We have no choice. We must stop. Barik, Deal with it. Barik hastily removed the tools from the saddlebag and went to repair the wheel while cursing under his nose. The other one inspected the broken wagon and hissed in annoyance. Ludwig, start a fire. This is going to take some time, he almost said through his teeth. Yes, sir, agreed without complaining, and jumped off the wagon. I'm going to scout the place, said the captain, picked another one of the torches and lit it, setting it ablaze with a reddish-yellow color. Is it a good idea to move away on your own in such an uncertain area? Lana asked him. She didn't receive an answer to that question, as the bearded man already walked off into the darkness. The young guard tried to dismiss the thought that it would not end well. Ludwig managed to find a few dried out sticks and started to make a bonfire. Several feet from the wagon, Lana, having nothing else to do, stepped aside, knelt down, and then began to recite something while clinging to her amulet. She grasped it so firmly that her knuckles got white from it. Yor did not know the language. He only understood the last words that were said in common language. Amira, mother, take care of him. Yor was the only one standing on guard. He looked around the area, looking for any signs that would seem out of place for him. Or more out of place than the rest of the bizarre creations that the flames were casting. Yor could feel the forest playing tricks on him. The shadows felt alive, almost as if they were jumping from a tree to a tree, surrounding their encampment from all sides. The most strange was that overwhelming silence. That was something he realized just now. No leaves rustling on the wind, no animal noises in the distance, nothing. The ranger and the driver were now sitting next to the bonfire, discussing something quietly and roasting a rabbit the girl caught in the morning. It was very thin and probably sickly, but at that moment that was all they had. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. The stale air felt as if it was trying to suffocate them. Boy! Boy! The prisoner called out to him, seeing the opportunity. It was so quiet that only he heard it. The young man felt unsure whether he should approach him. He looked around if there was anyone watching him. Everyone seemed busy at the moment, and he could not resist talking to the man. Yor couldn't exactly tell why, but there was something that made him want to talk to him. He approached him, hesitantly. Have you ever heard of Namathas, my boy? He asked softly. Yor stayed silent, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, staring at the man with suspicion. Namathas is the name of my master. He knows you're hurting. He knows your pain. He can help you, he continued. I do not believe in fairy tales, cultist, he answered as hard as he could. It did not work well. He believes in you. He can give you a lot. He could even find your father. His oddly charming voice resonated with the boy's mind. Don't try games with me. He's dead. I accepted it. He almost spat those words through his teeth. Did you? Asked the prisoner, then smiled terribly. After a pause, he continued. You blame yourself for not looking for him long enough, good enough. Face the truth. You gave up. You abandoned him when he was needing you the most. What if I told you he was still alive, that he suffers, and the only person who can help him is you alone? I want proof that these are not just the words of a mad old man. The boy was struggling to control himself and not burst into tears. The older man sighed and closed his eyes, stayed in meditation like that for a few good seconds, after which he opened his eyes and extended his hand. He was clutching some sort of object in his closed fist, holding it above the ground outside of the cage. The boy, against his instinct, reached out to receive the item. It was small, oval, and metallic. When he brought it closer to inspect it, he realized immediately what he was holding. Where did you get my father's brooch? Yor almost yelled out. The man did not answer. He only stared at him in silence. He stared at him with a gaze that felt to him as if it was piercing right to his very soul. Yor shivered, feeling violated by his insightful eyes. The boy looked down, right at the brooch. At the very moment, Images began to creep into his mind. They flashed one after another. A dungeon, some sort of cell, a chained man inside it, covered in blood and bruises. On his lips a name. Yor. More! Show me more! He cried out now, tears trickling down his cheeks. Shut up, boy! I'm trying to work here. Barik hissed at him from afar. The bald guard took out the wheel completely and put it on a large rock, bent over it and tried to fix it, hammering on it and throwing curses every few minutes. Yes, sir, sorry. He apologized and wiped the tears away with his sleeve. Yor stepped away without question and turned his back to the cage. He never respected that man. Barik used to make fun of him all the time because of his posture and his jumpiness, and there was nothing in the hierarchy saying that he should be obeying his orders. But he was the youngest one, so he had to listen to his seniors. Time was passing as Yor kept thinking about everything he saw, everything he heard. He tried to get it all out of his head, but it was all for naught. The image of his father suffering out there, calling out to him, was stuck before his eyes. The brooch he now held in his hand brought back a lot of memories. It was made of bronze and was shaped like a ladybug. There wasn't anything special about it besides the fact that it was a gift from him to his father. Always carried it on him. You could never see him without it. The boy gritted his teeth in frustration. Yor needed to know more, but there was no way for him to question the prisoner now. Had to wait for a good opportunity. He didn't have to wait long for it, but it gave out a loud sound of triumph, startling both of the guards sitting next to the fireplace. Shortly after, he already began to put the fixed wheel back onto the wagon. After he was done, he went back to the rest of the group and started to devour his piece of the rabbit. It took him only a few seconds to chew down every chunk of meat, right to the bone. "Are we ready to move?" Ludwig asked him. "Aye," he agreed. "The captain should be here by now." Lana was worried. "He will be fine, trust me, that man can't be stopped by anything." Ludwig chuckled. The girl didn't say anything. She only nodded and bit her lip. "That one time we got into a bar fight and this man..." He started telling stories from their younger age, when he had a few less silver hair on his head. Yor didn't intend to stay around and listen to any of them. He used this as an opportunity to sneak to the wagon and approach the prisoner. Had a lot of questions in his mind, but as their eyes met, he couldn't ask any of them. His throat felt suddenly parched, couldn't manage to speak out a word. Just stood there with his right fist clenched tightly. "There is a price for your father's life," the prisoner said, breaking the awful silence. "What price? I will give everything I have," the boy asked, now more composed than before. The cultist opened his left hand. With the index finger of his right hand, he traced a small line in the middle of his palm. Nothing happened for a few seconds, and then little droplets of his crimson blood started to squeeze through the shallow cut. He waited until there was enough. When he was ready, he dipped the tip of his finger in his own blood and began to paint some sort of circles and runes on the dry hardwood, while murmuring inaudible words under his breath. After he was done, the man leaned back and looked back at the boy. "A sacrifice of blood, but not yours. Someone you won't weep after. Someone you won't miss. All I require is a drop of your blood and your consent." The prisoner's eyes sparkled. Yor didn't think of the consequences for long. Life of people potentially unknown to him for the life of his father? A chance to make his family whole again? It was not a big price for him. "How can I be certain that you will keep your part of the deal? How can I be sure that you're telling the truth?" he asked. "You have my word that you'll find your father. The pact binds us both," the cultist explained. Yor took out his own knife that he used for skinning animals. With one sharp swipe, he sliced across the tip of his thumb. He extended his hand through the bars and let the drops of blood spill in the middle of the circle. The deal stands, Yor whispered in a trembling voice. Both the shapes and the runes suddenly lit up with fire and then disappeared shortly after, leaving no trace behind. What now? The boy asked after a moment of silence. Now we wait, he answered, and grinned terribly. Yor stepped back from the cage without questioning him further. For some reason he felt like it really did work. Even if it was just his wishful thinking, it gave him hope. Something he hasn't felt for a long while. Barik changed the lookout shift with Yor and let the boy rest. He didn't feel hungry, but Ludwig managed to convince him to eat at least some of the rabbit, so that he won't faint from the lack of strength. When he bit into it, the atrocious taste spread throughout his taste buds. The flesh was chewy and dry, as if the rabbit's meat was old. It made him think that he would rather feel weak from the lack of food than get sick from this, but he didn't say it out loud. The older guard only laughed and handed him a wineskin filled with ale. The beer wasn't all that better, but it managed to flush the chunks of meat down his throat. Next half an hour went quite peacefully. They talked, told stories to each other. It was one of the few times that Yor managed to find a subject to converse about with the rest. It's as if the three of them somehow managed to bond over how dreadful this forest makes them feel. He even managed to forget for a second about the pact and all else. I am worried about Derwan. I shall go look for him. Lana stood up all of a sudden. Neither of them tried to stop her, as they had a bad feeling about this too. She took one of the torches, fixed the longbow on her back and went off into the dark. She was visible for a second or two, and then poof, the darkness had swallowed her too. It was the first time she said the captain's name out loud like that. A thought crossed Yor's mind, that with the way the girl has been worrying about him, there might have been some feelings she had for him. Both the driver and the boy now sat there in an awkward silence, sharing a wineskin and taking a big gulp every now and then. Their moment of peace didn't last long, as both of them suddenly stood up, startled by the horrifying, throat-tearing scream from the direction the ranger went to. Barik, stay on guard. Yor, come with me. The graying guard gave out orders with a commanding tone. Yor nodded, grabbed the handle of the short sword he carried on his belt reassuringly, and ran after Ludwig. He ran fast, but the boy somehow managed to catch up and not trip over the enormous roots poking from underneath the ground. A few times he slipped on the wet, mossy litter, but caught himself just before falling down. They ran like that for quite a while before finally reaching the source of the weeps. They found the captain, leaning against a tree. He was already dead. His eyes were scratched out, completely gone from his eye sockets. But what was more terrifying was his smile. Unnatural, gnarled, frightening. No, Lana whimpered and began to cry, while clinging to Derwan's cold body. Yor stood there, terrified, stunned by the horror before him. Was that the part of the deal? Can the rest be in danger? Questions flooded his mind, and the feeling of guilt hit him bluntly. We have to run away from here. Quick! Shouted Yor, then added quietly, I made a mistake. Help me carry him. We cannot leave him here, Lana whimpered. Without a word, he pulled Derwan's shoulder over his head. Lana did the same. They started to drag his body back to the camp, as fast as they could. Neither of them dared to look back, afraid that the thing that killed the captain was still following them. When they arrived back at the camp, a lot had changed. The cage doors were open wide, with the key still inside the lock. It was empty. The prisoner was gone. Barik! Barik! Where are you? Ludwig called out the guard's name again and again. Yor and Yana put the body gently on the ground. The girl managed to find a piece of cloth. Then she put it on Derwan's head, covering his awful expression. She whispered a little prayer above him and stood up, wiping away her tears. Now all of them walked around the camp, calling out Barry's name. They didn't have to look for long. Barry! Oh no! The girl stopped mid-sentence and covered her mouth. She found him nearby. He was still alive, barely. The man lay there on his back, making gurgling noises and trembling. Had his eyes wide open. He was staring into the starless sky. There was fear in his eyes. Who would have thought that someone like Barik, a man who was dry, unfeeling, even sadistic, would be afraid of death? If it even was death that he was so afraid of. The ranger ran to him and dropped on her knees, right near him. She tried to inspect his wounds. His tongue has been removed. He bled heavily. There was no chance to save him. And she didn't even try. What she did instead of that was caressing his cheek slowly, comforting him in his last moments. He drilled a little more in place. Then the flame of his life went out. "Oh, Amira," she whispered in despair. "Come on, forget the cultist," Ludwig commanded and grabbed the girl by her elbow, lifting her up. The boy ran to the visibly scared horses and tried to cut them off. He planned to take the horses and go as far away as he could. Took out his knife, and just when he was about to start cutting the belts, he realized it's too late. Suddenly, they started to feel a sinister force exerting its influence on them. Exactly like the feeling of being watched from before, but now 10 times more. Its source was directed above their heads. They all felt it. Instinctively, they looked up, and at that very moment, they dropped everything they were holding. Just stood there with blank expressions. Stunned from the insane amount of mental pressure they could feel invading their minds. What they saw was the most terrible picture they had ever seen. It was a creature black as night, with dozens of tentacles encircling the 3 crowns. They couldn't see where its body ends and where it begins. It was as if the entity was everywhere, surrounding them from all sides. Its pitch black flesh covered hundreds of white, sharp teeth. The monster also had eyes. Not 1, not 2, but tens of them, scattered throughout. They all stared at them, without blinking once. They could not fully comprehend its appearance, nor its voice, and it was a beautiful, hypnotic, even divine voice, and it didn't belong to just one source. It was a whole choir, mixing together into a beautiful synergy. It whispered sweet melodies into their ears, tempting them towards things they could not understand. Yet they wanted to give in to it. They desired for it. Yor could not resist for long. He fell to the ground, delirious, shaking. Ludwig managed to free himself from the charm for long enough to swiftly load his crossbow and aim directly at the center of the shapeless, demonic mass. Just when he was about to fire, he stopped. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead of that, he dropped the weapon on the ground, took out a long hunting knife from behind his back, and put it against his own throat. He pressed it tightly against the skin, making a few drops of blood spill across the iron blade and down his neck. His hand trembled as he tried to resist the evil influence, but it was all for naught. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and ran the blade across his own throat. Instantly, a flood of blood burst from beneath the wound, spraying it across a good few feet. The man dropped his knife and fell down, first on his knees, then down on his stomach. The crimson red kept spilling from underneath him, making a nice puddle. Shortly after, he was already dead. Lana saw the whole event and couldn't do a thing, couldn't move a muscle. She cried from the feeling of being so powerless and helpless. She knew that nobody is coming to save them, knew that they're on their own and there is nothing that they can do. The girl closed her eyes, giving up. I am going to die here, she thought in her head, accepting her own death. But her death didn't come. Suddenly, she could feel a spasm of warmth spreading across her muscles, relaxing them at first. Then came another one, directly from her mind. Like a ripple on a lake, it eased her mind, restoring the clarity. She quickly realized that she can move. She opened her eyes. Nothing changed before her, but now she wasn't afraid anymore. All of the invading influence that she felt before has been gone. She noticed a bright, white glow. It was emanating from her medallion, shining around her, creating a sort of protective bubble. Lana could feel her goddess watching over her, protecting her from out there. She gasped and gripped her medallion tightly, thanking her savior. Realizing that she's not safe yet, she ran to the terrified horses, freed both of them and kept one for herself. Normally it wouldn't even think of letting anyone ride it at that moment, but the strange white glow eased it completely. She brought it closer to Yor and with a lot of effort she kept trying to pull him on one of the horses. He wasn't quite unconscious, couldn't form a sentence, but with her help he eventually got on the saddle in front of her. The ranger hit the sides of the horse with her heels, and in response it rushed across the forest as fast as it possibly could to get away from the entity behind them. She didn't dare to look back and see if it's following them. She just wanted to be away. Her arms held the boy loosely, not letting him fall. It was quite a challenge, as he wobbled left and right. At the same time she had to steer the horse, which was even harder. It would be impossible to ride a horse without a torch, which she didn't bring with her, but the white glow emanating from the medallion gave more light than any torch would. They rode like that endlessly, not stopping once, just rushing ahead. Lana could have sworn that this forest isn't that big. Hours were passing, and yet they still couldn't see the edge. Even though the situation was dire, she didn't even think for a moment about giving up. Not when Amira is with her, she thought. Where's that bloody X? She was about to finish her sentence, but then she gasped, seeing a man standing still in the middle of the road. She couldn't get a closer look as the horse suddenly tripped over a branch and fell over, neighing loudly as it did. Both Lana and Yor were sprung from the saddle. They flew through the air, high above the man's head, landing many feet ahead. They hit the ground, and as they did, the girl could hear an awful cracking sound of bone. She didn't know whether it was her bone or his, as she was immediately knocked unconscious by the impact of her head hitting the base of a nearby tree. She could feel a sudden blunt pain and then nothing. The girl blacked out completely. It took some time before Yor regained consciousness. The headache dulled his senses. His whole body ached from the crash. He didn't have enough courage to look up, to see if the entity is still there. He heard footsteps approaching him. Lana managed to survive? Yor thought hopefully. He raised his head slightly, saw a hand reaching to his chin. It wasn't feminine. There was a rune burned on the back of it, rune that Yor did not recognize. The hand gently lifted his chin up. Now the boy could take a closer look at the person before him. It was a young man, in his late 20s, and even though he looked much different from before, Yor could tell that it's been no one else than the cultist with whom he made the deal with. He had no wrinkles on his face. His grey hair changed into long, raven black curls that reached his shoulders. The unkempt beard he had before now turned into a silky smooth goatee. He was almost unrecognizable from before, but there was still a part of him that Yor recognized. It was that maleficent aura that both scared him and intrigued him at the same time. "Time for my part of the contract," said the cultist, and his eyes lit up. Instantly, an agonizing pain spasmed through his right hand. He brought it closer to see, and what he saw was a symbol appearing on it, more and more clearly. It was lit in a fiery red color. The pain was unbearable, burning, sizzling, hot. It was as if someone shoved his hand inside the fireplace. The next thing he saw were more images. A small hill near a forest, close to the capital city. A tall, broken white tree, hit by a thunder in the past, now dead and dry. A dungeon underneath it. Yor knew this place. When he was still a child, he went with his father to hunt in those areas, with him and his siblings. Those were nice days. That was his last thought before losing consciousness yet again. When he woke up, the cultist was already gone. Yor lay there, on a wet from dew grass, staring at the sky through his eyelashes. It was already morning. He could hear birds chirping and singing. Beams of sunlight emerged from behind the leaves. A new day has come, but not for Yor. It took him more than a day to reach the place. He didn't stay in taverns, didn't sleep or eat. He had only one goal. When he finally stood in front of the white tree, he could not believe that he managed to find his father. After all those years, he felt guilt and euphoria at once. So many people have died for his wish. It's something that would weigh on him for decades. He knew that, but at that moment, he couldn't let that sacrifice go to waste. The search for a hidden hatch did not last long. He could feel himself almost being guided by the images still burned out in his mind. He went down the ladder into the dungeon. He picked up one of the torches hanging on the wall, lit it, and went with an unsure step. At the end of the corridor, he found a large iron door. When Yor touched the metal handle, the door made a distinctive, sizzling sound. The hand on which he had the rune started to burn him again, now slightly less than before. He hissed, but managed to persevere through the pain. After a second or two, the door gave out a clicking sound and opened wide. Yor did not have time to think about how all of that works. He stepped into the room. The moment Yor crossed the threshold, he could smell the horrible stench of decay. It invaded his nostrils relentlessly. He had to use all of his willpower not to vomit. The smell of decay wasn't a good sign, but he tried not to make any assumptions. It was quite a spacious cell. From the place he was standing, he couldn't see the end of it. The boy took a few steps forward, and then he stopped. At the wall on the other end of the cell, he saw a man in shackles, pinned against the wall with chains. For a split second, he felt that all he did was worth it, that the moment of fulfillment of his dreams was right in front of him. He took another few steps forward, and then he dropped the torch in horror. He could clearly see his whole body now. The man was already in an advanced state of decay. His father has been dead for a long time. Many years have passed since that horrible night. From the testimonies of people, it follows that Yor completely lost his mind after losing his companions and his father. For the first few months, he tried to gather a group of people to go to the forest and bury his old comrades. Most did not believe him, or did not want to believe him. When he finally found a few less timid visitors from another country, he set off to give the deceased a dignified death. Wanted to at least in a small part atone for his terrible deeds, he said. When they arrived and scoured through the whole forest, there were no bodies or any evidence found. Since then, Yor was known as Yor the Madman.